In a world where wealth and status often shield the guilty, a single act of bravery from a young boy shatters the illusion, leaving even the most powerful speechless. The courtroom was vast, its marble floors gleaming under the cold, unforgiving glow of chandeliers that hung high above. Rows of wooden benches were packed with spectators, their hushed whispers weaving through the air as they craned their necks to catch sight of the unlikely figure at the center of it all. A frail 6-year-old boy standing on trembling legs, clutching a tiny, fragile baby to his chest. Darius had never stepped foot in a place like this before. His world had always been the alleyways, the forgotten corners where shadows became shelter and indifference was all he had ever known. The world had never cared about boys like him, but today none of that mattered. Today, he was seen. The murmurs grew louder as he took another step forward, his grip tightening around the baby wrapped in his tattered coat. His heart pounded like a drum against his ribs, but his feet did not falter. He had walked through the freezing streets, past people who refused to meet his gaze, past the towering mansion where this child had been discarded like refuse. And now, he stood here before them all, daring them to look away. A wave of disbelief rippled through the room. The judge, an older man with silver hair and weary eyes, adjusted his glasses and peered down at the boy standing before him. His voice, though steady, carried the weight of something deeper. Concern, perhaps, or disbelief. "Who brought this child here?" Darius lifted his chin, his voice small yet unwavering. "I did!" Gasps filled the chamber. The prosecutor, a stiff, sharp-eyed man in a pristine suit, narrowed his gaze. "And who are you?" Darius swallowed hard. He had been asked that question before, but never as if the answer mattered. "My name is Darius," he said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "I found her." The judge's stern expression softened, but the prosecutor remained unmoved. "Where did you find this baby?" Darius tightened his hold, his small arms forming a protective barrier around the child. "In a dumpster," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Behind the big house on Jackson Street." Silence crashed over the room like a wave. Even the reporters, who had been furiously scribbling notes, seemed momentarily frozen. Jackson Street. Everyone knew what that meant. That house belonged to the Holbrooks. The Holbrooks, untouchable, revered, their name woven into the fabric of wealth and prestige, a family admired for their philanthropy, their flawless image, their carefully curated perfection. And yet, in the arms of a homeless boy, stood the truth they had tried to throw away. The judge leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "You are telling this court that the child in your arms was abandoned by the Holbrook family?" Darius nodded, his throat tight. "I heard them talking," he said softly. "They said she wasn't good enough. That she—" his voice wavered, but he forced himself to continue. "That she wasn't perfect." A woman in the back gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. The Holbrooks had built their legacy on exclusivity, on the idea that their name represented something untarnished, something superior. But now, in this moment, that illusion was unraveling thread by thread. The prosecutor straightened his tie, grasping for control. "And why," he said, his voice clipped, "should we believe you? You're just a child, a homeless child." Darius met his gaze, his small frame dwarfed by the enormity of the courtroom. But his voice, filled with something greater than fear, rang clear. "Because the truth doesn't need a home to exist." "How do we know you're telling the truth?" Darius had been expecting this. He had spent years being overlooked, dismissed, his words ignored as though they carried no weight, as though he himself did not matter. But today, he would not be silenced. Taking a steady breath, he carefully pulled back the edge of the baby's blanket. A gasp rippled through the courtroom, sharp and collective, like a sudden gust of wind through dry leaves. There, resting on the baby's delicate wrist, was a bracelet, gold, thin, impossibly expensive. The name etched into it gleamed under the harsh courtroom lights, a name that sent a shiver through every person who laid eyes upon it. The people in that courtroom had spent years believing that wealth determined worth. But today, They were being forced to confront a truth they had long ignored. A 6-year-old boy, standing in rags, had reminded them what justice was supposed to mean. Darius stood firm, his small frame unwavering beneath the crushing gravity of the moment. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if the world would do what was right. But he had done what he could. And for the first time in his life, the world was finally listening. Darius had spent his life navigating a world that had no place for him. He had never known the warmth of a bed, never felt the security of walls that belonged to him. The streets were all he had ever had. Cold pavement beneath him, the proof was undeniable. The judge leaned back in his chair, his face grim, his expression unreadable. The prosecutor, who had moments ago spoken with such authority, looked away, his mouth slightly open but void of words. The room, once filled with murmurs and doubt, had plunged into a heavy silence. Darius tightened his grip around the baby, his voice carrying through the thick, suffocating quiet. "They threw her away," he said, his voice trembling, yet filled with something deeper than anger, something raw, something unbreakable. "But she isn't trash." His arms curled protectively around the tiny body, his fingers gripping the frayed edges of his coat, as though shielding her from the weight of the world. "She's somebody." A lump formed in the judge's throat as he studied the boy before him, a child who had nothing, yet had shown more humanity than those who had everything. The people in that courtroom had spent years believing that wealth determined worth, but today they were being forced to confront a truth they had long ignored. A 6-year-old boy, standing in rags, had reminded them what justice was supposed to mean. Darius stood firm, his small frame unwavering beneath the crushing gravity of the moment. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if the world would do what was right, but he had done what he could, and for the first time in his life, the world was finally listening. Darius had spent his life navigating a world that had no place for him. He had never known the warmth of a bed, never felt the security of walls that belonged to him. The streets were all he had ever had. Cold pavement beneath him, empty alleyways that became makeshift shelters, and the distant glow of houses where warmth existed but never welcomed him inside. Despite the cruelty of the world around him, Darius had never allowed himself to become hardened. He had seen too much suffering, too many faces etched with hunger and despair, and no matter how little he had never turned his back on someone who needed help. But if there was one thing he had learned, it was this: the world didn't value people like him. Wealth decided worth, and he had none. The people who passed him on the street never met his eyes. They saw the torn fabric of his clothes, the dirt on his skin, the bare soles of his feet, and they turned away. To them, he was invisible, and no one embodied that indifference more than the Holbrook family. The Holbrooks were untouchable, the wealthiest, the most powerful, their name woven into the fabric of high society. Their fortune had been built on generations of exclusivity and influence. Their parties made headlines. Their reach extended into every corner of the city. They lived in a world where appearances were everything, where perfection was the only standard, and their obsession with control did not stop at their business empire. It extended into their home, shaping the lives of those under their roof with an iron grip. To the outside world, the Holbrooks had it all: money, prestige, a flawless reputation they had spent decades meticulously crafting. But behind the towering gates of their grand estate, that obsession with perfection strangled everything it touched, even their own child. Eleanor Holbrook had been born into wealth, but not into love. To her parents, she was not a daughter. She was a reflection of their status, an extension of their image. From the moment she took her first breath, she was expected to fit into the perfect mold they had created. There was no room for flaws, no space for anything that did not align with the flawless narrative they had built. But then something shattered that illusion. Eleanor was born fragile. Her tiny body was weaker than expected. The doctors had assured the Holbrooks that she would grow stronger with time. that she simply needed care and patience. But to the Holbrooks, weakness was unacceptable. She was supposed to be perfect, a future heiress to the family name, not a child who required extra attention. Their disappointment turned to neglect. Rather than care for her themselves, they handed her off. She became an inconvenience to be managed, not a child to be loved. And so the responsibility of raising Eleanor fell to someone who should have never been trusted with a child's life, the nanny, Mrs. Calloway. She had spent years working for the wealthy, absorbing their beliefs, internalizing their sense of superiority. She worshipped the Holbrooks, their status, their influence. To her, they were the standard, and everyone outside their world, everyone like Darius, was beneath them. She treated Eleanor with the same cold indifference she had learned from her employers. The child's cries were met with irritation rather than comfort. Her needs were burdens rather than responsibilities. To the world, the Holbrooks had everything. But behind closed doors, a helpless child was fading into the background, an afterthought in a home where image mattered more than love. And one night, that indifference took its final form. Darius had been wandering the streets, searching for something, anything, to eat when he stumbled upon a truth that would shake the city to its core. Darius had been searching for warmth. The night was bitter, the kind of cold that gnawed at his bones, turning hunger into an ache he could no longer separate from himself. His bare feet moved silently over the frozen pavement, his thin coat doing little to shield him from the sharp wind. He had no destination. He never did. He simply wandered, hoping to find some forgotten corner where the night wouldn't feel so endless. And then he heard it. A cry. So faint, so fragile, it could have been mistaken for the wind slipping through alleyways. It wasn't the kind of sound people in this neighborhood noticed, not from behind their warm, glowing windows, not from inside. Inside their grand houses, where the world's ugliness never reached. But Darius noticed. The sound was a thread, pulling him forward, guiding his steps through the darkness. He followed it, weaving through silent streets until he stood before the towering gates of the Holbrook estate. The cries were coming from the side of the house, near the trash. Darius's stomach twisted as he stepped closer, the towering bins casting long shadows in the dim streetlights. And there, tucked beside them, barely wrapped in a thin blanket, was a baby. His breath caught in his throat. For a moment he couldn't move. He had seen cruelty before. He had felt its cold grip around his own life. He had been pushed aside, ignored, treated like nothing. But this was something else. His small hands trembled as he knelt down, carefully gathering the child into his arms. She was tiny, her skin far too cold, her breath so weak he almost couldn't feel them. He pressed her against his chest, his body acting on instinct, shielding her from the night's merciless chill. How could anyone do this? He didn't need to guess. He already knew. The Holbrooks. The family whose name carried weight in every corner of the city. The family whose wealth had built an empire of influence. The family who had everything. And yet, here she was, discarded like garbage. Darius tightened his grip, holding her closer, listening to the unsteady rhythm of her breathing. He knew what it felt like to be unwanted, to be nothing in a world that only saw value in power and perfection. She wasn't perfect. She wasn't what they wanted, and so they had thrown her away. But she wasn't trash. She was somebody. Darius didn't hesitate. He turned his back on the grand estate, on the towering gates that had never opened for people like him. He stepped into the only world he had ever known, the streets. The difference was this time he wasn't alone. As he walked, the weight of her tiny body against his chest filled him with something unfamiliar, something that made the cold a little easier to bear. Responsibility, purpose, a silent promise whispered in the space between his heartbeats. I see you. I won't let you disappear. The judge folded his hands, watching the boy carefully. And you decided to bring her here? Darius swallowed, his small arms adjusting around the baby's frail body. She needed help. Murmurs spread like wildfire. Some voices softened with pity. Others were edged with doubt. But Darius didn't care about their whispers. For once, they were listening. The prosecutor cleared his throat. And how do we know this isn't just a story? His voice had hardened now, folding itself into suspicion. You're a homeless child. Why should we believe you? Darius stiffened. He had spent his entire life being doubted, being ignored, being dismissed. But not this time. Wordlessly, he lifted the edge of the baby's blanket. The golden bracelet around her tiny wrist caught the light, delicate and expensive. A gasp echoed through the courtroom, then another. It wasn't the bracelet itself that turned the air electric. It was the name. He didn't know where he was going. He had no home, no safe place to take her. The streets were cruel, and he wouldn't let her be swallowed by them. His feet carried him forward, guided by nothing but desperation. And then he saw it. A building he had passed countless times. A place where people went when they needed justice. The courthouse. His heart pounded as he stepped through its doors, his arms curled protectively around the baby. The warmth inside hit him like a wave, a sharp contrast to the icy night. But the relief was brief. The moment he walked in, voices murmured, heads turned. A 6-year-old boy, barefoot, dressed in rags, carrying an infant in his arms. It was a sight that didn't belong in a place like this. Gasps filled the air as he stepped into the center of the courtroom, the weight of countless disbelieving eyes pressing down on him. He swallowed hard, standing in the face of power, privilege, and judgment. For the first time in his life, the world was looking at him. And this time, he refused to be invisible. The courtroom was stifling, not from heat, but from the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on every soul inside it. Darius stood in the center, a child dwarfed by the towering walls, the polished wooden benches, the grand table where the lawyers sat whispering behind their expensive suits. He did not belong here. And yet, at this moment, he was the one they all listened to. The judge sat high above, his gaze sharp, assessing. The prosecutor leaned forward, his skepticism barely concealed behind a furrowed brow. So, the man said, voice deep, measured, you're telling this courtroom that the Holbrook family left this child outside? In the cold? Darius nodded once, tightening his grip around the fragile bundle in his arms. She was crying, he said simply. Nobody came for her. A ripple of unease moved through the room. The judge folded his hands, watching the boy carefully. And you decided to bring her here? Darius swallowed, his small arms adjusting around the baby's frail body. She needed help. Murmurs spread like wildfire. Some voices softened with pity. Others were edged with doubt. But Darius didn't care about their whispers. For once they were listening. The prosecutor cleared his throat. And how do we know this isn't just a story? His voice had hardened now, folding itself into suspicion. You're a homeless child. Why should we believe you? Darius stiffened. He had spent his entire life being doubted, being ignored, being dismissed. But not this time. Wordlessly, he lifted the edge of the baby's blanket. The golden bracelet around her tiny wrist caught the light, delicate and expensive. A gasp echoed through the courtroom, then another. It wasn't the bracelet itself that turned the air electric. It was the name engraved into it. Eleanor Holbrook. Silence swallowed the room whole. The judge's expression darkened. Is there a representative from the Holbrook family here? A man in an impeccable suit shifted in his seat, his movements suddenly uneasy. He stood slowly, his usual confidence cracking under the weight of truth. Yes, Your Honor. The judge's stare was piercing, unwavering. Then would you care to explain why a 6-year-old boy has brought your family's child into this courtroom instead of her being safely in your care? The silence that followed was devastating. Darius looked up, his heart pounding. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the one being ignored. He was the one demanding answers. The courtroom had never been so still. Every gaze was locked on the small boy standing alone, arms wrapped around the baby as though shielding her from the world that had already failed her. Darius could feel their stares, heavy, uncomfortable, expectant. But he did not waver. His voice, though quiet, filled every corner of the room. "I may not have a home," he said, his fingers tightening around the infant, "but I know how to care, and I know that love means never leaving someone behind." The words struck like a hammer, ringing out in the suffocating silence. The judge, a man who had spent decades presiding over cases, leaned forward, his fingers laced together, his once imposing expression shifting into something more human. Darius drew in a steady breath. "I've seen a lot out there," he continued, his voice strong. "I know what it's like to be ignored, to be treated like nothing. But a baby? A baby doesn't deserve that." He turned his head slightly, scanning the rows of well-dressed spectators, their faces pale with discomfort. "They left her like she didn't matter," he said, his words cutting deep. "But she does." Another murmur swept through the room. Even the prosecutor, who had questioned him so coldly before, shifted uneasily in his seat. The judge exhaled, slow and measured, before turning his gaze to the Holbrook family's representative. "Is there an explanation for this?" The man in the expensive suit cleared his throat, though no amount of practiced composure could mask the tremor in his voice. "Your Honor, this is a private family matter." A scoff echoed from somewhere in the crowd. A whisper followed, sharp as a blade. "A family matter?" After what they did. Darius held the baby closer. He could still feel the lingering cold in her tiny body, the way she had trembled in the night when he first lifted her into his arms. He would not let them turn this into just another scandal to sweep away. He stepped forward, looking directly at the judge. "If I left her out there," he said, his voice unwavering, "people would call me a monster. They'd say I was cruel." He turned toward the Holbrook representative, his next words slicing through the air like a knife. "But when they do it, it's just a family matter?" A sharp gasp rippled through the room. The rawness of it, the undeniable truth in it, left no room for argument. The judge's fingers tapped against the wooden desk, his expression unreadable, but his silence spoke volumes. Darius had said what no one else dared to. For years, families like the Holbrooks had built their power on the belief that they were untouchable, that money and status could erase their sins. But this could not be erased, because tonight, standing before them in torn clothes and bare feet, a child had done what no one else had. He had forced them to see. They had discarded her as if she were nothing. And yet, a homeless boy who had nothing proved he possessed more heart than they ever could. A woman in the crowd clutched her chest, horror spreading across her face. "How could they do this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Another voice joined hers, then another, until the room was awash with murmurs of disbelief and outrage. The very same people who had once turned a blind eye to Darius, who had ignored him as he wandered the streets alone, now looked at him with something unfamiliar, admiration. But none of that mattered to him. All that mattered was her. The baby in his arms, the child they had abandoned, the tiny soul who had been left to the elements, as if she were no more than an afterthought. The judge finally spoke, his voice grave with the weight of what had just unraveled before him. "This is not just a private matter," he declared, his gaze cold and piercing as it fixed on the Holbrook representative. "This is a crime. This is neglect." The color drained from the Holbrook representative's face, his lips parted as if to protest, but no words came. Because what could he say? The truth was laid bare for all to see. Darius's heart thundered in his chest. He had done it. He had forced them to listen. For the first time in his life, the world wasn't looking past him. They were looking at him, and they would never forget what they had seen. The illusion of power that had shielded the Holbrooks for generations had shattered. Their wealth, once an impenetrable fortress, now felt like a fragile shell crumbling under the weight of their own misdeeds. They had always believed they were untouchable, that money could erase any wrongdoing. But not today. The judge repeated his verdict, each word landing like a hammer striking stone. "This is neglect." The courtroom, once filled with hushed whispers of disbelief, now pulsed with outrage. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every moment, knowing this case was no longer about one abandoned baby. It was about power, privilege, and the unspoken injustices that had gone unchecked for too long. The Holbrook representative struggled to maintain his composure, but there was no saving face. The scandal had unraveled before the world, exposing the family for what they truly were, people who had abandoned their own flesh and blood simply because she did not fit their perfect image. And in the midst of it all, Darius stood firm. He was no longer just a trembling boy holding a fragile infant. He was a force, an undeniable truth they could no longer ignore. But the fallout wasn't just in words. The courts moved swiftly. Child Protective Services intervened, ensuring that Eleanor Holbrook would never again be seen as disposable. Investigations were launched, and for the first time the Holbrooks faced the very thing they had spent their lives avoiding: accountability. Everything had changed. Only days ago, Darius had been another invisible child, another forgotten soul wandering the cold streets, dismissed and disregarded. Now he stood at the heart of something far bigger than himself. A movement, a reckoning, a shift in the way society viewed the ones it had chosen to overlook. The same strangers who once crossed the street to avoid him now looked at him with reverence. News stations dubbed him the boy with the unbreakable heart. People wanted to know his story, to understand how a child who had nothing could possess more courage than those who had everything. But Darius didn't care for the headlines. He only cared that Eleanor was safe. He only cared that for once, people were paying attention, not just to him, but to the countless children like him, the ones the world conveniently forgot. And then, something unexpected happened. An apology. The Holbrooks had been silent throughout most of the proceedings, their pride keeping them from showing any emotion. But as the trial concluded, as the verdict was sealed, something in them shifted. The courtroom doors had barely closed when Eleanor's mother stepped forward. The meticulously polished image she once upheld had crumbled. Her face was pale, her eyes heavy with something she had never allowed herself to feel before: guilt. She hesitated before speaking, her voice raw. She swallowed hard, struggling to find the words. I don't have the right words. Darius said nothing. He didn't need to. The weight of her guilt was hers to carry, not his. We were wrong, she admitted, her voice cracking under the weight of her own shame. About everything. She reached out, her hand hovering uncertainly over Eleanor's small back. The baby stirred but remained peaceful in Darius's arms. We let our own fears and prejudices blind us, she whispered, her voice barely holding together. We let our idea of what we deserved decide what she was worth. And we were so wrong. Darius studied her. He had spent his entire life reading people, learning when words were empty and when they held weight. This time, they held weight. It didn't erase what had happened. It didn't change the fact that they had nearly lost their daughter forever. But it was a beginning. And maybe, just maybe, it was enough to make them see the world differently. In the weeks that followed, Darius's life transformed. No longer was he just a nameless child lost in a broken system. People who once ignored him now reached out, offering help, offering hope. He was given a place to stay, a warm bed, a chance at a future. But more importantly, his story ignited a conversation, one that could no longer be silenced. Questions that had long been avoided were now being asked, about privilege, about race, about the way society decided who was worthy and who was invisible. And it had all started with a 6-year-old boy who refused to walk away. For years, the world had treated Darius as if he did not exist, a shadow moving through the streets, unseen and unheard. But when it mattered most, he had made a choice. He chose to care. He chose to stand up when no one else would. And in doing so, he had forced the world to see what it had long ignored. A 6-year-old, homeless and forgotten, had stood before a system built to protect the powerful and demanded justice. His small voice had carried more truth than the carefully constructed lies of the privileged. He had not just saved Eleanor. He had exposed a truth that no one wanted to face. For too long, power and wealth had shielded those who did wrong, while those like him, poor, black, unseen, were cast aside. But the moment he stepped into that courtroom, holding a child they had thrown away, he rewrote the rules. Darius was no longer just a nameless boy. He was the boy who made them listen, and the world would never be the same again.